In the early 1940s, as the world burned in the fires of total war, the United States embarked on a secret technological crusade that would eventually dwarf even the Manhattan Project in its initial complexity and cost. This was the birth of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, a machine that was not merely an airplane, but a flying laboratory of futuristic destruction. While the B-17 Flying Fortress had become a symbol of the war in Europe, the American High Command realized that the Pacific theater presented a challenge of a completely different magnitude. To strike the Japanese home islands from distant island bases, the United States needed a bomber that could fly further, carry more, and operate at altitudes that were previously thought impossible for a heavy aircraft. The B-29 was the answer to this desperate geographical puzzle, a $3 billion gamble that pushed the limits of aeronautical science to the breaking point before the first prototype even left the ground. The B-29 was the ultimate expression of American industrial overmatch. It featured a revolutionary pressurized cabin, allowing crews to fly at 30,000 feet in shirt-sleeve comfort, while the air outside was thin and freezing, a luxury that Japanese pilots in their unpressurized cockpits could only dream of. It was equipped with a computerized remote-controlled gun system, where gunners used analog computers to aim turrets from a distance, correcting for windage and lead with mechanical precision. But the most terrifying aspect of the B-29 was its engines, the Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclones. These were temperamental, high-performance monsters that produced 2,200 horsepower each, but were so prone to catching fire that the early B-29 missions were often as dangerous for the crews as they were for the targets. The Americans were not just building a bomber, they were weaponizing the stratosphere, creating a platform that could strike with impunity from a height where the very air was an ally. For the Japanese leadership, the first sightings of the B-29 were a psychological shock that shattered their sense of invulnerability. Since the beginning of the war, Japan had relied on the vastness of the Pacific Ocean as its primary defensive wall, believing that no enemy could ever bring a sustained heavy bombardment to the heart of the empire. The B-29 proved that this wall had been bypassed. When these silver giants first appeared in the skies over the home islands, they looked like something from a science fiction novel, sleek, shimmering, and seemingly untouchable. They flew so high that they were often invisible to the naked eye, appearing only as thin white contrails etched across the blue sky. The Japanese realized with a growing sense of dread that the Americans had achieved a level of technological transcendence that Japan's war-weary industry simply could not match. The strategic intent behind the B-29 went far beyond simple destruction. It was designed to be a system-level weapon. General Henry Hap Arnold and the architects of American air power envisioned a campaign that would not just hit factories, but would dismantle the very structure of Japanese society. They understood that Japan's industry was decentralized, with thousands of small cottage workshops feeding the larger assembly lines. To stop the Japanese war machine, they had to burn the cities themselves. The B-29 was the only tool capable of delivering the massive tonnage of incendiaries required for such a monumental task. From its inception, the Superfortress was destined to be the silver scythe that would harvest the Japanese empire, proving that industrial might and scientific innovation could render traditional bravery and defensive fortifications completely obsolete. This first chapter of the B-29 story is one of raw, unchecked ambition. It was a project so large that it involved over 7,000 subcontractors and a workforce of hundreds of thousands, all focused on a single goal: reaching Tokyo. The Americans were betting the entire outcome of the Pacific War on this one airframe, believing that if they could master the high-altitude environment, the Japanese would have no choice but to surrender or face total annihilation. As the first production models rolled off the assembly lines in Wichita and Renton, the world was about to witness the dawn of a new era of warfare, one where the distance between the hunter and the hunted was measured not in miles on a map, but in thousands of feet of altitude that the defender could never hope to climb. The B-29 was the physical embodiment of the end of the old world and the terrifying arrival of the new. The most devastating advantage of the B-29 Superfortress was not its bomb load or its defensive guns, but its ability to weaponize the very air itself through the power of altitude. The B-29 was designed to operate at a cruising altitude of 30,000 to 32,000 feet, a realm of the atmosphere that was, for all intents and purposes, a different planet to the Japanese defenders of 1944. At these heights, the air is thin, freezing, and lacks the oxygen necessary for both human life and high-performance combustion. While the B-29 utilized its advanced General Electric turbo superchargers to compress the thin air and feed its massive engines, and its pressurized cabin to keep its crew conscious and warm, the Japanese military found itself grounded by a technological chasm they could not bridge. The stratosphere became a sanctuary for the American bombers, a high-altitude highway where they could fly toward their targets with a sense of invulnerability that bordered on the divine. For the Japanese pilots of the Imperial Army and Navy Air Services, attempting to intercept a B-29 was a mission that pushed both man and machine into a state of terminal failure. Most Japanese fighters, such as the legendary A6M0 or the Kai-43 Oscar, had been designed for the low to medium altitude dogfighting of the early war. Their engines were naturally aspirated or utilized primitive single-stage superchargers that gasped for air above 20,000 feet. As a Japanese pilot tried to climb toward the silver specks of the B-29s, his engine would lose power. His controls would become mushy and unresponsive in the thin air, and his cockpit, lacking heat and pressure, would become a frozen chamber of hypoxia. By the time they reached 25,000 feet, many Japanese engines would simply stall out or overheat, leaving the pilot to watch helplessly as the American formations sailed thousands of feet above them, mocking their bravery with a shimmering wall of silver. Even the few specialized high-altitude interceptors Japan attempted to field, like the J-2M Raiden or the Kai-44 Shoki, struggled to make a dent in the B-29 formations. These planes were climbers, designed to scramble quickly, but once they reached the B-29's altitude, they had almost no energy left for maneuvering. A Japanese pilot would often have only a single fleeting chance to make a pass, usually a desperate head-on attack, before his plane began to fall out of the sky due to a lack of lift. Furthermore, the B-29's speed at high altitude was nearly equal to that of the fighters trying to catch it. In the thin air, the Superfortress could maintain over 350 miles per hour, meaning that if a Japanese fighter wasn't perfectly positioned in front of the formation, it could never hope to chase the bomber from behind. The defenders were essentially trying to catch a bullet with a net made of smoke. This technological mismatch created a psychological crisis within the Japanese military command. They realized that their traditional doctrine of spiritual superiority was useless against a foe that they physically could not reach. The Japanese radar systems, though improving, were often unable to provide enough warning time for their struggling fighters to reach the necessary altitude before the B-29s had already dropped their payloads and turned for home. This led to a state of altitude-induced paralysis, where the Japanese were forced to watch their cities be mapped and scouted with impunity. The Americans weren't just bombing, they were demonstrating that they owned the sky. This realization that the home islands were open to the sky destroyed the last remnants of the Japanese public's belief that their divine winds, the kamikaze, could protect the heart of the empire. The final layer of this failure was the B-29's defensive fire control system. Even if a Japanese pilot managed to survive the climb and the thin air to close in on a formation, he was met by a wall of 50 caliber machine guns directed by the Central Fire Control, CFC system. This was the world's first computerized aerial defense. Gunners used remote sights to track targets, while 5 analog computers calculated the lead, gravity drop, and parallax. A Japanese fighter, struggling to stay airborne in the thin atmosphere, was an easy target for a system that could track it with mathematical precision. The result was a slaughter. The B-29 was a fortress in every sense of the word, a machine that turned the stratosphere into a killing field, where the defender was at a constant lethal disadvantage. The altitude gap was the first true sign that the war was not just being lost, but that the very concept of Japanese defense had become obsolete. Despite the B-29's staggering technological superiority, the early months of the bombing campaign were marked by profound frustration within the American Strategic Command. Operating from newly captured bases in the Mariana Islands, crews attempted to execute daylight precision bombing, the same high-altitude doctrine that had been used to dismantle German industry. However, Japan presented an unforeseen meteorological obstacle, the jet stream. At altitudes of 30,000 feet, winds exceeding 200 miles per hour blew the bombs miles away from their targets, rendering the expensive $3 billion machines ineffective. It was into this stalemate that General Curtis LeMay stepped in January 1945. A ruthless and pragmatic strategist, LeMay realized that for the B-29 to fulfill its mission of breaking the empire, it had to abandon the safety of the stratosphere and descend to the level where Japanese defenses were weakest, and where American impact would be absolute. LeMay made a decision that shocked his subordinates and superiors alike. He ordered the B-29s to strip away nearly all of their defensive machine guns to increase their payload capacity and to attack at night, from an altitude of only 5,000 to 9,000 feet. By descending from the stratosphere, LeMay was intentionally neutralizing the aircraft's greatest defensive advantage, its altitude, but he was exploiting a much greater Japanese vulnerability, the almost total absence of effective night fighters and low-altitude radar coverage. More importantly, he changed the ammunition. Instead of high-explosive steel bombs, the B-29s were loaded with the M69, a napalm-filled incendiary cluster bomb designed specifically to turn Japan's wood and paper cities into literal blast furnaces. This was no longer just a tactical shift. It was a fundamental change in the nature of the war, transforming the B-29 from a precision tool into a weapon of mass annihilation. The logic behind this low-level descent was purely mathematical and terrifyingly efficient. At lower altitudes, the B-29 did not have to fight the jet stream, which increased bombing accuracy by over tenfold. Additionally, the Wright R-3350 engines, which constantly suffered from overheating in the thin air of the stratosphere, operated with much higher reliability in the dense air of lower altitudes. By removing the weight of the gun turrets and the thousands of rounds of ammunition, each Superfortress could now carry over 7 tons of incendiary bombs. LeMay understood that Japanese bravery and the Bushido spirit could not combat the cold physics of combustion. He was preparing the B-29 to carry out what would become the most destructive air raid in human history, surpassing even the firebombings of Dresden and Hamburg in terms of sheer lethality and industrial efficiency. The first major test of this new doctrine occurred on the night of March 9, 1945, during Operation Meeting House against Tokyo. Over 300 B-29s swarmed over the capital at low altitudes, unleashed 2,000 tons of napalm. The result was a firestorm of biblical proportions that consumed 16 square miles of the city in just a few hours. The heat was so intense that it created its own violent updrafts, tossing the massive B-29s like paper toys as they flew over the inferno. The Japanese defense, which had spent years training to look up and struggle against the impossible heights of the stratosphere, was caught completely off guard by this low-level onslaught. The anti-aircraft guns and the few available night fighters could not track the hundreds of silver giants emerging from the darkness. Illuminated only by the orange glow of the city, they were incinerating. The psychological impact of this shift was the final death blow to Japan's sense of security. The Japanese people, who had previously viewed the B-29 as a distant, untouchable star in the high sky, now saw it as a literal monster that descended from the clouds to spit fire directly onto their homes. LeMay had transformed America's greatest technological jewel into a tool of absolute psychological terror. Japan was no longer just being defeated militarily, it was being dismantled socially and industrially. The B-29's ability to operate effectively both in the stratosphere and at the treetop level proved that there was no sanctuary left in the entire archipelago. This phase of the campaign marked the transition from strategic air war to total war of liquidation, with the B-29 serving as the final executioner of an empire that simply had no answer to the fire. While the B-29 was a masterpiece of offensive technology, its victory was made total by the systemic failure of the Japanese integrated air defense system. By 1945, Japan's radar technology was nearly a decade behind that of the United States. While the Americans were using advanced microwave radar to guide their bombers, and track targets through clouds, the Japanese were still struggling with primitive, long-wave early warning systems that were highly susceptible to interference and ground clutter. These radar stations often failed to detect the high-altitude B-29s until they were already over the coastline, leaving the defense with only minutes to react. When the bombers descended for LeMay's night raids, the situation became even more dire. The Japanese had almost no effective ground-controlled interception (GCI) capabilities, meaning that once the B-29s were in the air, the Japanese command was essentially blind, unable to guide their few available fighters toward the massive American formations. The crisis of the Japanese night fighter program was the most visible symptom of this technological bankruptcy. Because Japan had focused almost exclusively on daytime air superiority during the early years of the war, they lacked specialized aircraft equipped with airborne radar. Pilots were forced to rely on their own eyesight and the aid of ground-based searchlights to find the B-29s in the dark. Even when a searchlight managed to lock on to a silver Superfortress, the B-29's speed was so great that the light would often lose the target before a fighter could close the distance. Furthermore, the B-29 began employing early forms of electronic warfare, dropping strips of aluminum foil known as window or chaff to saturate Japanese radar screens with false echoes. This technological smokescreen made it impossible for the defenders to distinguish between a single scout and a massive strike force, leading to a state of total administrative and tactical paralysis. The anti-aircraft artillery, AAA, units on the ground fared little better against the American onslaught. While the Japanese had thousands of anti-aircraft guns, they lacked the proximity fuses and sophisticated fire control computers that made Allied AAA so lethal. Their shells were mostly timed fuse, meaning they had to predict the exact altitude and speed of the B-29, a near-impossible task against a pressurized bomber that could vary its height and speed with ease. At high altitudes, the shells often exploded far below the target. At low altitudes during the firebombing raids, the sheer number of B-29s overwhelmed the gunners' ability to track individual planes. The sky over Tokyo and Osaka became a chaotic mess of uncoordinated fire that more often than not fell back onto the Japanese civilians below, adding to the carnage rather than preventing it. Compounding this technical failure was the catastrophic shortage of high-octane aviation fuel and trained pilots. By 1945, the American submarine blockade had strangled Japan's oil supply, forcing the military to prioritize fuel for the most desperate missions. Japanese pilots were often sent into the air with only a few dozen hours of flight training compared to the hundreds of hours logged by B-29 crews. These novice pilots were expected to perform complex night interceptions against a heavily armed, computerized bomber, while flying aircraft that were often mechanically unreliable due to a lack of spare parts. The result was not a battle, but a slaughter. The Japanese defense system was no longer a shield. It was a crumbling ruin that offered only symbolic resistance to the silver scythes cutting through the atmosphere. The final realization for the Japanese command was that the B-29 had rendered their entire defensive geography obsolete. They had built their defenses around the idea of protecting specific military points, but the B-29 was destroying entire urban systems. The failure of the radar and the night fighters meant that the heart of the empire was perpetually exposed. This was the moment when the Japanese leadership began to pivot toward the only defense they had left, the suicidal kamikaze attacks. However, even these were largely ineffective against the B-29, as the bomber's defensive guns and high speeds made them difficult to ram. The collapse of the air defense system was the ultimate proof that Japan was no longer a modern military power capable of protecting its own citizens. It was a nation waiting for the inevitable, its sky belonging entirely to a machine it could neither see nor stop. By the spring of 1945, the B-29 campaign had evolved from a series of experimental raids into a clinical, industrial-scale liquidation of Japan's manufacturing capability. The American planners, led by the analytical minds in the target modeling units, realized that Japan's economy was uniquely vulnerable to air power. Unlike the heavy, centralized industrial complexes of Germany's Ruhr Valley, Japanese industry was a fragile, cell-based system. Major factories like those of Mitsubishi or Nakajima relied on thousands of tiny, home-based workshops scattered throughout the urban centers of Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. These workshops produced the small parts, the valves, the bolts, and the wiring, that were later assembled into the Zero fighters and the heavy artillery. The B-29 was the perfect tool to destroy this ecosystem. By firebombing the residential districts surrounding the large factories, the Superfortress was not just killing people, it was incinerating the very subcontracting tissue that kept the Japanese war machine alive. This strategy of industrial decapitation was executed with a ruthless, cold-blooded efficiency. When the B-29s unleashed their napalm loads over the urban centers, they were effectively cutting the supply lines before the supplies were even manufactured. Within weeks of the first major fire raids, the production of aircraft engines plummeted by over 50%. Even when the large reinforced concrete factory buildings survived the flames, they found themselves isolated in a wasteland of ash. The workers were dead or homeless, the electricity was cut, and the thousands of small shops that provided the necessary components had been erased from the map. The B-29 had bypassed the Japanese military entirely, striking the foundation of their power and rendering the tanks and planes at the front useless for lack of spare parts and ammunition. To make the collapse total, the B-29 campaign was extended to Japan's internal logistics through Operation Starvation. This was a secondary but equally lethal mission, where superfortresses were used as high-altitude mine layers. They dropped thousands of acoustic and magnetic mines into the Shimonoseki Strait and the entrances to Japan's major harbors. This mission effectively blockaded the Japanese home islands from the air, a feat never before achieved in naval history. The B-29s were essentially strangling the empire. On one hand, they were burning the factories that processed raw materials, and on the other, they were sinking the ships that brought those materials in. The result was a complete halt in the flow of coal, iron, and oil, causing the Japanese industrial output to flatline, even in areas that hadn't yet been bombed. The technological sophistication of the B-29 allowed it to perform these diverse roles with a level of precision that the Japanese could not counter. Whether it was high-altitude mining or low-level firebombing, the Superfortress acted as a multi-role platform that could adapt to any strategic requirement. This adaptability meant that no sector of the Japanese economy was safe. The B-29 crews used radar scope photography to map out the industrial choke points of the Japanese rail and port systems, ensuring that every bomb and mine was placed where it would do the most damage to the empire's ability to survive. The Japanese defense was forced to spread its dwindling resources so thin that it became effective nowhere as the Silver Scythe moved from one industrial target to the next with terrifying regularity. Ultimately, the B-29 did more than just destroy buildings. It destroyed the Japanese leadership's belief that they could continue to wage a modern war. By the summer of 1945, the empire was an industrial corpse. The military commanders found themselves with thousands of soldiers and hundreds of planes, but no fuel to fly them, no parts to repair them, and no factories left to build new ones. The B-29 had achieved a total decoupling of the Japanese soldier from the industrial base that supported him. This was the true meaning of making defenses obsolete. The B-29 didn't need to fight the Japanese army. It simply removed the army's ability to exist as a modern force. The Silver Scythe had harvested the industrial heart of the empire, leaving behind a nation that was physically and economically hollowed out, waiting only for the final blow. For centuries, the Japanese people had been indoctrinated with the belief that their islands were protected by the kamikaze, the divine wind that had once destroyed invading Mongol fleets. This sense of spiritual invulnerability was the cornerstone of the Japanese home front's morale, even as the war turned against them in the Pacific. However, the arrival of the B-29 Superfortress systematically dismantled this mythological shield. When the silver bombers appeared in the stratosphere, untouched by the Emperor's fighters and invisible to the naked eye, they represented a power that was not just military, but almost supernatural. The psychological shock of seeing the unreachable sky filled with the metallic glint of American technology destroyed the public's faith in their leaders' promises. The B-29 was the physical proof that the divine wind had been conquered by American science, and that the emperor himself was powerless to protect the very heart of the empire. The psychological warfare shifted from awe to terror as the B-29s descended for the low-level firebombing raids. The Superfortress was no longer a distant star. It was a loud, roaring monster that dominated the night. The sound of hundreds of Wright R-3350 engines vibrating through the wooden walls of Japanese homes became a form of psychological torture, a precursor to the inevitable rain of fire. The Japanese government tried to maintain order through propaganda, calling the B-29s B-san or Mr. B, but the attempt to domesticate the threat failed. People began to realize that their government's bamboo spear philosophy, the idea that spirit could overcome steel, was a death sentence. The sight of a single B-29 scouting a city with total impunity was enough to cause mass panics, as the population knew that where one silver scythe appeared, hundreds more would follow with the fire that turned their cities into ash. To further accelerate this mental disintegration, the B-29s were used to drop millions of leaflets, such as the famous LeMay leaflets, which listed specific cities that were scheduled for destruction. This was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. It told the Japanese people that the Americans had so much power that they didn't even need the element of surprise. By warning the civilians to flee, the Americans were simultaneously acting as a humanitarian force and demonstrating absolute dominance over the Japanese military. If the Imperial Army couldn't stop the Americans from announcing their targets in advance, how could they possibly protect the people when the bombs actually fell? This led to a mass exodus from the cities, causing the total collapse of the urban workforce and creating a refugee crisis that the Japanese administration was completely unprepared to handle. The B-29 also shattered the social hierarchy and the cult of the warrior, as for years the Japanese public had been told to sacrifice everything for the military. But now they saw that the military was failing in its most basic duty, defense of the home soil. The sight of B-29 crews often flying without their defensive guns, showing a complete lack of fear toward the Japanese Air Force, was a stinging insult to the Bushido Code. It suggested that the Americans viewed the Japanese defenders not as worthy adversaries, but as irrelevant nuisances. This realization sowed seeds of deep resentment and despair among the civilian population. The collective will to fight was being incinerated alongside the buildings, replaced by a cold, nihilistic understanding that the war was not just lost, but that their entire worldview had been based on a technological and spiritual lie. By the summer of 1945, the psychological state of Japan was one of catatonic exhaustion. The B-29 had created a reality where sleep was impossible, where the sky was a source of constant dread, and where the future was a smoking ruin. The Superfortress had achieved the ultimate goal of strategic bombing. It had decoupled the population from the state. The Japanese people were no longer working for the emperor's victory. They were simply trying to survive the American scythe. This internal collapse meant that when the final blows of the war arrived, the nation was already a psychological hollow, ready to accept the unthinkable: surrender. The B-29 had not only made Japanese defenses obsolete, it had made the very idea of Japanese resistance a physical and mental impossibility, proving that in the age of the Superfortress, there was no sanctuary for the spirit when the sky belonged to the machine. By the summer of 1945, the B-29 had already proven it could destroy entire cities through the brute force of fire, but its final role would be to serve as the delivery system for a weapon that redefined the nature of existence. This was the Silver Plate Project, a highly classified modification of a select group of B-29s, including the now famous Enola Gay and Boxcar. These aircraft were stripped of nearly all armor and turrets to save weight, equipped with reversible pitch propellers for shorter landings, and fitted with modified bomb bays to carry the Little Boy and Fat Man devices. The B-29 was the only aircraft in the world capable of carrying these massive multi-ton atomic weapons across the vast distances of the Pacific. It was no longer just a bomber. It had become the chariot of the apocalypse, the only machine designed with the structural integrity and high-altitude performance required to survive the shockwave of a nuclear detonation. The missions to Hiroshima and Nagasaki represented the absolute zenith of the obsolescence the B-29 had created. When the Enola Gay approached Hiroshima on the morning of August 6th, it flew in a small three-plane formation that the Japanese radar operators initially dismissed as a mere reconnaissance flight. Because the B-29 had spent months scouting the home islands with impunity, the Japanese had become desensitized to small groups of aircraft. They didn't even sound the air raid sirens in some areas, believing that 3 planes couldn't possibly pose a threat to a major city. This was the ultimate irony of the B-29 campaign. The machine was so superior that its very presence had lulled the defenders into a state of fatal complacency. The technological gap was so wide that the Japanese could no longer distinguish between a routine observation and the total annihilation of a metropolitan center. The physics of the atomic drop required the B-29 to perform a maneuver that pushed the airframe to its absolute limit. So after releasing the bomb from 31,000 feet, Colonel Paul Tibbets had to execute a violent 155-degree diving turn to escape the impending blast radius. The B-29's advanced aerodynamics and pressurized structural strength allowed it to survive the massive G-forces and the subsequent atmospheric shockwave that hammered the plane like a giant baseball bat. At that moment, the B-29 was no longer a tool of conventional war. It was the delivery mechanism for a new era. The Japanese defenses were not just obsolete, they were irrelevant. There were no fighters in the sky, no shells in the air, and no warnings on the radio. There was only the silver glint of a lone B-29 high in the blue, followed by a light that outshone the sun. The second mission to Nagasaki, flown by Boxcar, demonstrated the terrifying reliability of the B-29 platform even under mechanical failure. Despite a malfunctioning fuel pump that rendered hundreds of gallons of gasoline unusable and a primary target obscured by clouds, the B-29's range and navigation systems allowed the crew to divert to the secondary target and complete the mission. The Japanese military, still reeling from the news of Hiroshima, was completely unable to intercept this second lone bomber. The silver scythe had returned to finish the harvest. The atomic bombings were the final proof that Japan was no longer fighting a war in the traditional sense. They were being systematically erased by a technology they could not even comprehend, let alone combat. The legacy of the B-29 as an atomic platform is one of chilling efficiency. It proved that a single aircraft, flying at an altitude the enemy could not reach, carrying a weapon the enemy did not have, could force the unconditional surrender of a fanatical empire. The B-29 had made the millions of Japanese soldiers waiting on the beaches for an invasion completely meaningless. It had made the kamikaze squadrons, the hidden caves, and the bamboo spears of the civilians relics of a bygone age. On the morning after Nagasaki, the Japanese leadership finally understood that the B-29 had closed the door on their history. The machine had become the master of the sky, and in doing so, it had rendered the very concept of Japanese national defense a tragic, smoking memory. When the formal surrender of the Japanese Empire was signed on the deck of the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, the sky above Tokyo Bay was filled with a final overwhelming demonstration of power, a massive formation of nearly 500 B-29 Superfortresses. As the roar of 2,000 Wright R-3350 engines vibrated through the air, it was a sound that signaled more than just the end of a conflict. It was the funeral march of the old world. The B-29 had achieved what no other weapon in history had done. It had forced a major world power to surrender without a single enemy soldier ever having to conduct a land invasion of the home islands. The silver scythe had proven that in the age of industrial technology, the traditional metrics of military strength, bravery, terrain, and manpower could be completely bypassed and rendered obsolete by a platform that owned the stratosphere. The legacy of the B-29 extends far beyond the ashes of Tokyo and Hiroshima. It was the literal progenitor of the Cold War and the modern era of strategic deterrence. The technologies perfected in the B-29, pressurization, computerized fire control, and long-range heavy lift, became the foundational DNA for the next generation of global reach. The Soviet Union was so terrified by the B-29's performance that when 3 American crews were forced to land in Vladivostok during the war, Stalin ordered a bolt-for-bolt reverse engineering of the aircraft, resulting in the Soviet Tu-4. The B-29 had set the global standard for what a superpower looked like. It taught the world that the ultimate expression of national sovereignty was no longer a border fence, but the ability to deliver total destruction to any point on the globe from an altitude that no one could defend. Furthermore, the B-29 fundamentally changed the relationship between the civilian population and the state in times of war. It demonstrated that in the era of strategic air power, there was no longer such a thing as a home front that was safe from the front lines. The B-29's ability to incinerate entire urban systems meant that every factory worker, every clerk and every child was now a direct participant in the theater of war. This total war capability, delivered with the clinical precision of American industry, led to the development of the Strategic Air Command, SAC, which would dominate global politics for the next 4 decades. The B-29 was the father of the B-52 and the grandfather of the B-2, establishing a lineage of American air supremacy that remains the cornerstone of global security to this day. The B-29 also served as a grim reminder of the cost of technological stagnation. Japan's defeat was not a failure of courage, but a failure of imagination and industrial capacity. The empire had entered the war with a 19th century mindset, believing that spirit could overcome the machine. The B-29 was the ultimate rebuttal to that philosophy. It showed that once a nation loses the technological high ground, its defenses become a mere formality. The Silver Scythe didn't just win a war, it closed an entire chapter of human history where wars were fought on the ground and on the sea. From 1945 onward, the decisive factor in human conflict would be the mastery of the sky and the cold, mathematical application of air power. In the final analysis, the B-29 Superfortress remains the most significant aircraft of the 20th century. It was a $3 billion gamble that paid off in the total reorganization of the world order. It was the machine that ended the most destructive war in history and simultaneously birthed the nuclear age. As we look back at the shimmering silver formations over Japan, we see more than just bombers. We see the beginning of the world we live in today, a world where peace is often maintained by the silent, high-altitude threat of a machine that can make any defense obsolete. The B-29 didn't just harvest an empire, it harvested the future, leaving behind a legacy of fire, ash, and the chilling realization that in the age of the machine, the sky is no longer a sanctuary, but the ultimate high ground of the gods.